Is there a little part of you that is trying to get you and you're not letting it say what it has to say? That's what we're going to discuss in today's episode, why you want to bring all those parts together and how it's actually going to improve so many areas of your life. I'm your host, SD Rappaport, a productivity coach who helps you rewire your brain to be more efficient and effective. And today I'm excited to bring on a clinical psychologist who works in the Manhattan School of Music. Thank you so much, Michael Alcée, for being here. I am super excited to be speaking with you. You want to start by telling us something you did as a kid that people still laugh about today?
Oh, man. I've always been a collector of different images and metaphors, and I've always written in journals about different ideas. And so you'll find me with loads of little notebooks of things that intrigue me, of things, of sayings, of little quotes, of ideas, or things that I'm trying to process. And then, of course, my wife always gets on my case because I'm like my mother. I always have like 5 books that I'm reading at the same time because I find it interesting to kind of go between one and the other. And I will get to them, but it looks like I have like this kind of messy library.
Oh God, what type of things would you keep in your notebook? Like any specific quotes that you recently added that you really liked?
Oh my gosh, there's always something like, like I just was telling somebody who was talking about how difficult it is to write. And there's a wonderful quote by the poet Paul Valery, and he says, poems are not completed, they're abandoned. And that, our writing can feel like orphans sometimes because we kind of don't fully finish it, but somehow it's taken.
Yeah.
And the creative process is like that. And I think even when you think of those journal ideas, they're like little orphan ideas too. They're these wonderful ideas that you like collect, but they can seem like a motley assortment of things because they're philosophers, they're poets, they're artists, they could be anything. They can even be like business gurus. You're like, oh, that's a really interesting idea.
Awesome. So you keep them, and do you ever like actually look through back at them, or like they just stay there forever?
No, they usually stay there forever. But the funny thing is that they work themselves into your psyche in a way. And that's what's so cool about the act of writing. I find that even the act of writing itself somehow is like a memory process. And what I love about, reading and writing is that it's a constant discovery and rediscovery of that which you already hazily know.
Totally. I know, like, even my memory is like down in the dumps, and like even short-term things, everything has to be remembered. But if I want to remember for long-term, for sure, it has to be like written down and put on paper, literally, with not even just like typing, it has to be written with my hand. So it actually gets into my memory. So totally on with that. Okay. Now you do really interesting things, and I'm curious to know how you got started in being a clinical psychologist, and specifically in your niche of clinical psychology.
Yeah, it's in 2 ways that's funny. Like, so one, my mom was a social worker, so I always grew up around talking about stories and she loved literature. So talking about stories and how people work was always something that was in our conversations. And when I was in college, I did a course in psychology that had me working with people. And I felt like all of a sudden, when I was doing that kind of work, the time just floated away. Like when you have a moment, like whenever you're doing something creative, you know that you lose time, or you almost feel like time is like eternity. And so that's what kind of drew me to psychology. But then the college counseling, which is what I've done so much of, is really just practical because in this day and age, it's one of the places at the time where you can get the most therapy experience. Like other settings, sometimes you have to do more paperwork, or sometimes you have to deal with different kinds of other challenges or politics. With college, the main part of it is working one-on-one. And so for me, it was like, oh, to have more time to do that, that's what I want. So to me, like therapy is like this, it's like the music to me. And so like where you're going to get the opportunity to play the most music. And so that's what college counseling became for me.
And what do you find to be the biggest struggle in the clients that you work with?
Yeah, there's so many different things, but I think people are most challenged by how contradictory we are as human beings. Like we say we want one thing, but then we do another. We wish to be with this person, and yet we choose the one that's totally seemingly wrong and yet seemingly right for us. And, we also struggle with our own sort of sometimes perfectionism of, I want to achieve this, but I don't necessarily feel it. But how do I connect to that feeling of motivation or energy? So I think for me, the most exciting thing is to learn that the fact that we're contradictions, that we're walking contradictions, isn't a design flaw. It's actually this interesting part of what makes us work. And that when we can figure out how to be more in tune with that, it's surprisingly, paradoxically, we can be more productive. We can be more fulfilled. But sometimes we often do these interesting, elaborate ways of running away from ourselves. And by running away from ourselves, we're actually losing the muse. We're losing the source of what we need to get back to feeling more meaning, feeling more connection, or feeling more productivity.
If this is something that's part of human nature to be this contradictory thing, is it something that we should try to change, or how should we view it so that way it works for us and not against us?
Yeah, no, I think most of us, I think it's logical and sensible that we all try to outrun this thing. And I think especially when we're younger, we think, oh yeah, no, that's not going to happen to me. Especially like when folks go like start college, they're like, oh yeah, I'm just on the linear up and up. This is just going to get better and better and better. And we really do believe in our 20s and 30s, like, no, I'm going to figure out this system. People just don't get it. But eventually you're right. There's actually no way of getting around it. The only way, we can't go around it. We can only go through it. And so it's almost like reconciling, almost like these different sides of ourselves, as if they're almost if you think about it, it's like a different government. Like, what Lincoln did in American history, which was so interesting, he kind of brought together a lot of his sort of political rivals and made them his cabinet. And there's something really instructive there, because we want to try and befriend and humanize these sides of ourselves instead of trying to shame them and disconnect from them. So I jokingly describe therapy as the art of having a table where you invite all the sides to come, and you're curious about which side talks the most, which side talks the least, and which side doesn't even get invited or allowed to the table. And in our work together, you get more kind of curious and open to how those different sides, like how they speak, what kind of airtime that you can give them. And you find that even the side that feels like it's irritating or annoying might have something of value to give. And sometimes the part of yourself that you thought is the most valuable might also be actually holding you back in ways you didn't realize. So you're right. It's really interesting. Instead of trying to take this stuff away, it's really helpful to figure out how to have them to collaborate more creatively. And that, by the way, is the connection to efficiency as well. Because the more that we can work with these sides and get them to really, really gel, we don't have to change who we are. And that's when we're more authentically ourselves. And that's what gives us our distinctive voice.
Yeah. And it's not like using up so much energy trying to fight it all the time. Do you have any specific tips or ways of how we could actually bring all these parts together with us, like talking to these parts? I know that I was once working with someone who she had me make index cards, or a little bit bigger than index cards, of all the different parts, literally cut out pictures from magazines or online and put them in, and then journal with those parts. Or what do you do?
I love the idea. I think any way that we can sort of embody or personalize or almost make these sub-personalities into characters is helpful, right? Like trying to sort of envision them and also seeing what tone they're bringing, there's some parts of us that can be that dissenting opinion with sarcasm, that that critic side, which is always the most difficult. There can be sides that are really scared or sad or angry. And I think it's really important to try to figure out how we can bring them into line. So, for example, how when the pandemic started, we were in lockdown about 2 years ago. And I remember it was like a month or two in, and I was having those pandemic nightmares. And I was waking up in the mornings and I was trying to pretend like I was pretty okay. And then all of a sudden I started to have these little fears about, oh, wait, what if I have a cavity and I have to go to the dentist, and oh my God, and then I can't go, and all these neurotic worries. Now, I started to think about, wait, which sides are not being allowed to talk here inside my psyche? And I'm like, you know what? I haven't really acknowledged this side of myself that feels a little bit scared. I don't know where this is going and feels a little out of control. And when I started to make a little space for that side to say, why don't we talk a little bit? As I did that, all of a sudden my ruminations and obsessions just sort of melted away. And I was like, yeah, this isn't so easy dealing with this stuff. And so that's the other thing that's counterintuitive about it that I think we're also taught against, is that we're taught to like kind of try to override negative emotions with positive emotions. Think about all the good stuff going on for you, right? Or think about like what you're good at, which is great. But sometimes we also really need to have, not only in ourselves, but with support of others, leading into the things that aren't so difficult, just because. Like, no one caused the pandemic. No one wanted to be in this position. And yet there are going to be these negative reactions that need to be heard, need to be witnessed. So in order to flow, we need to be witnessed. And so we need to constantly think about witnessing ourselves. And it's almost like learning to have more self-compassion and self-acceptance and self-love.
Yeah. It's like accepting all parts of you. Usually I find the ones that are the hardest to accept are the ones that people in society have the have a harder time to accept. So either it could be things that you've gotten as a kid, or it could be things that just like social media and stuff that people post all about. And then you're like, hey, I don't want to enter that area. But really, emotions aren't good or bad, and they're just there to tell us something. So we have to like give it a voice, so that way we could work through them.
That's right. Emotions, like you said, are really more. Freud once said something interesting to his patients, his early clients. He said, we're not really responsible for our feelings. They just are. They come like the waves. Sometimes they're choppy, sometimes they're smooth, sometimes they're, stormy, whatever. But we might be responsible for how we present or represent our feelings, but we're not responsible for the fact that they're there. And often feelings are really valuable messengers. And sometimes if we're not really listening to ourselves, they really amplify things and distort things. But if we also recognize and try to decode, they're not trying to tell me everything is terrible. They're trying to tell me you're not listening to the fact that you feel angry or scared or sad or something else that's difficult to stay with.
Yeah, totally. I like that. We're not responsible for our emotions, but how we deal with them and show up with them and process them. 100%. Yeah. Okay. Now let's get into productivity. What do you think people struggle most with in productivity, and how do you help them with it?
I think you're right. I think one of the things that we implicitly struggle with the most is telling ourselves that we should do this or we should do that, or as part of what our goals are. We make it very, for lack of a better term, sort of left brain driven, which is like logical, linear, which is helpful. We need that side. Those sides help us to execute things and put them into practice. But oftentimes that's more extrinsically motivated, like motivated on, ooh, I want to get the reward of that, or I want to feel the goodness of it. But a better way to really motivate is to get into the intrinsic motivation part of it. Like it's almost like getting in touch with your own appetite. So it's not what you should do. It's what you're interested in, what you're curious about. So I think when we think of productivity, it'd be nicer if we could also think about like, how are we going to have a fuller appetite for the world and what we want to accomplish? And when you're excited about that, then some of the other stuff that we do have to do becomes a lot easier. So for example, like to write a book is not so easy, right? Or to make a piece of art is not so easy. And there might be some part of us saying, oh, I should do that, or I need to do that. But it really comes more fully if you say, what do I really need to write? What do I want to write? What am I moved to share? What is this piece of art or whatever it is? What is it that I want to share with the world? How do I tap into that? And so there's something about it that's more inner motivated, not external motivated. So I think it's a paradox. I think it's counterintuitive. I think the external thing flows better from the internal. But I think we often go the opposite route.
Oh, yeah. I think a lot of it comes like just from like school and the way like we're taught of thinking, like writing essays or just assignments in school of this is what you have to do. And it's assignments. So afterwards we do that for ourselves. Like, okay, I need to write this book because this is some sort of goal that I put on myself rather than I want to write this book. But if we decide, okay, I want to write this book. Now, what's next step? Okay, I want to write a book. What I want to share. So I have this topic that I want to share about, but there's still a lot of barriers and a lot of things getting in the way of actually being able to write it.
Completely. I think the other thing too is that we have to sort of follow the trail of of some of our thoughts and feelings. And, the other thing about creativity is it really starts to come out when we discover something and are surprised. So sometimes there's a side of ourselves that wants to be too predictable. Sometimes when I'm writing, I feel like, oh, wait, I know where I want this to go. Or I think I know where I want this to go. But the better part is if you let your writing see where it takes you a little bit, right? And to see what you didn't realize you wanted to say or what you were trying to get at. So there's a little bit of a surrendering and there's a little bit of controlling and there's a little bit of surrendering. Then they work together hand in hand. I think sometimes we try to over muscle it towards, I need to be in control of what I'm producing. And we eventually will be more control, but we also want to let go and let into it. So let's just say, Esty, you wanted to write about something or you wanted to create a work of art. Then I want you to try to see where it free flows as you just let's say, write about it or talk about it, even in conversation. No expectations of where you should or shouldn't go, right? Which is important. Freud said something to his clients. One of the only rules he gave his clients early on was that they should just free associate. Whatever comes into your mind and try to do that as best as possible. And the thing about that is having this sort of improvisational approach to it helps. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you never plan before you start anything.
The interesting thing is you do. So it's a lot like a jazz improviser. Most people think that a jazz improviser is just, oh my God, they just get up on the bandstand and they just all of a sudden they see this music for the first time and they're just doing it. Not at all. They've probably heard this song hundreds of times before. They've also probably played songs with similar chords many times before. But what they're allowing to do is to see what now in the moment can I make of it? And that's why it feels so much more intimate, so much more connected, right? So planning is great. So planning, again, I think planning actually, I don't want to give planning a bad name. Yes, planning is great. That's what I meant about those notebooks. When I was younger and I'm writing, if I'm working on a project, I'm writing little notes all the time on my phone, or I'm putting little voice memos. And those are little bits of planning. But then you kind of almost let them see what kind of connects with them. So you plan and then you let go and you come back to the plan. And then you see where they kind of interconnect together. So I think actually, Esther, you've kind of created something interesting in terms of how we're talking about it, which is it's sort of planning some part of it. I think I know what I want to do. I think I know what I want to write, but I'm open to not being fully sure and letting to see where that goes. So that's the thing, what makes therapy go, right? Imagine if somebody came in through a therapy session. Imagine if you came into a therapy session and I said, Esty, this is what we should talk about. Because, as you talk to me for the first few minutes, I think this is what we really need to do. Wouldn't you feel sort of a little bit offended? Wait, let me tell my story, right? Or, you don't really know what full advice to give to me because you don't know me as fully yet. And it turns out we need to be that way with ourselves too, of I'm going to ask you certain questions that allow you to come out, but I'm going to try and follow your lead. And then once I really hear, I might say, Esty, I'm seeing some interesting patterns here, some interesting themes here. What do you think? Again, collaborative. So it's always coming back to this more collaborative approach, not just because we should, but because we're curious about connecting more deeply. I think sometimes we don't think of productivity as connection, and productivity can be very linked to connecting to our fullest selves.
I think it's actually exactly like you said, it's the ultimate productivity is being able to link to yourself and working with yourself and the way your brain works, the way your body works, and merging it all together. And so you're just much more in flow more of the time.
And something that I think you've really keyed in on in your, in your work and your interviews is how important it is to kind of know how you uniquely work, right? And I think learning your own learning style, learning the way that your mind works, learning the way that your emotions work is like, we can have like some general ideas about how they work, but it's really more important to know how they work, right? So when I was starting out as a therapist, cognitive behavioral therapy was like the therapy that people, and they still talk about it quite a bit, DBT and things like that. But what I realized is that I'm a logical person, but I'm not as pragmatic. I think much more in metaphor. I think much more in image. And when I tried to force myself into something that didn't really work with my style, I wasn't really effective at it. And I wasn't alone. Freud was the same way, interestingly enough, when he was very bad at hypnosis. And he would try to hypnotize his patients, and they'd kind of tease him. I'm not asleep, they would say. And he dispensed with it partly because he wasn't good at it, but partly because he felt like it wasn't as helpful. So I think sometimes there are hidden kind of treasures in the way that we uniquely work. And so who says there's one way? There's never one way. There's no, I think what our goal is to figure out is our sort of metaphorical instruction manual, what our specifications are and how we work best. And then I think one of the goals of therapy in life is to develop a really good troubleshooting section at the end of that book. So we're like, right? How does this work? But also coming back to what works for me.
Yes. Now, how do we do that when someone's together in a relationship and I work one way, my partner works another way? How are we merging these two together?
It's a really great point. I've seen that sort of firsthand with the pandemic, because like I'm a very kind of process-oriented, feelings-oriented guy, and my wife is so much more a thinking-oriented, like logic-oriented. Her style is like wants to have things a little bit tidier, and mine's like I'm fine with things a little bit more open-ended. So it's been interesting over the pandemic watching how those two styles have to figure out each other. I think the link is empathy, like really trying to imagine what it's like in that space, for the other person, and I think compromise is really important there too. Right. So, for example, I learned that my wife doesn't like to have too many dishes in the sink before the day starts, if possible. Not completely, but to me, I don't care. And especially if it's a sunny day and I can have some good walking time and get some great ideas, then I'm fine. I'll do that at night. But sometimes it's a compromise of realizing, if this makes her feel like her world is better and more ordered, great. And she respects that I sometimes will have very messy piles in my office or even downstairs in the rest of the house, and that's how I roll. And so sometimes having to figure out like how we can help respect each other and support each other. And the other thing too is recognizing that our styles are also a way in which we feel a sense of order and stability in the world itself.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like we're fighting about things that are super important when we get into tiffs with each other when we have different styles. But then we also want to try to imagine, hey, even if this isn't my style of organizing, that's what makes them feel like their world is okay and whole. And when we come with that empathic framework, I think we can find better compromises together. Right.
Totally. Yeah. It comes from that place of understanding and seeing where they're coming from, how their brain works and how they're different from you to really be able. I think that I find that in any area of life, usually, as soon as you understand where the other person is coming from, it's so much easier to just be empathetic.
Yeah. And it's a lot similar to like introverts and extroverts, right? Or ambiverts that like, for someone who's an extrovert, they get really stimulated by being in social situations and they don't want to stop. Like Bill Clinton was famous for like not stopping talking to people in meetings and just schmoozing for hours on end. And, if you're someone who's more introverted, that can drive you crazy. And I'm more of an ambivert, somewhere in between. So like we jokingly call it the Jewish goodbye is like you take like 5 hours to say goodbye. You've said goodbye and then you're on the way out and you're holding things and you're still talking. And then like an hour later, maybe they're going and opening the door. And then maybe a half an hour later, they're in the car waving. And sometimes you want the Irish goodbye, which is the Irish goodbye is not saying goodbye and just kind of slipping out. And I think it is really just important to notice how people work with these things and to figure out. And some of it just makes us funny as human beings. Like we have these just little quirks.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Do you have any advice on how to work with yourself and bring all your components together in making your entire day more productive?
Yeah. I think we really have to learn how to humanize the critic part of us, the part of us that's like a little bit of a bully, the shooting side on us, or the side of us that's like constantly kind of saying we're not good enough. Right. And oftentimes, that comes because, like you said, it could come from teachers, it could come from childhood bullies, it could come from family, it could come from situations of real trauma, which is trying to protect us. But really working on healing those sides is really important. And then also tapping into a state that I think wonder is where the muse comes. Like children are wonderful at staying connected to wonder. They're curious, they're open. And so I think wanting to cultivate that side and also notice it in lots of different areas. I think as adults, we tend to we shut it down a little bit or say that that's silly. But I have a 4-year-old son, and I feel like one of the reasons we get along so well is because I haven't forgotten what it's like to be 4. And I think it's important to kind of keep connected to those sides. So I think it's really important to kind of how we sometimes do if you want to be in touch with your body, you do sort of body scan to see where my tension is in my neck or my shoulders or anything like that. I think every once in a while we should just do a scan to see how's everybody doing in here? What's going on with you? How are you feeling? And as silly as that might sound, sometimes one thing that's helpful for people is journaling. Sometimes journaling in the morning or journaling in the evening or journaling when you're feeling stuck. And just freely writing into that stuckness rather than avoiding it or, writing that I'm so frustrated that I can't figure out why I'm feeling the way that I'm feeling. Or I don't know what I'm thinking here. And that allows us to have regular conversation with these sides.
Yeah, totally processes it and lets all the emotion come out, lets those sides come out. Even better would be is to try journaling with your non-dominant hand, to have a conversation between 2 different parts of you, one with your right hand, one with your left hand, whichever one's your dominant and non-dominant hand, and just journal back and forth, see what will come out of there.
Another one that's really interesting that I think we forget because we don't have that much private space anymore, especially because we're sort of bombarded by these, is I think in the morning shower, for example, or the evening shower, it's the place where all of a sudden my psyche all of those different sides start to kind of come out of their cages and start talking. And so I think it's a place where we can just have a little bit of focus of just noticing, as you do, a lot of the times these sides come out when we're not trying to force them, right? You notice little kids want to play when they don't feel smothered, right? Or they don't feel like you're too distant. They need just the right kind of connection. And so sometimes these sides will also come out when we're doing something like walking in nature or reading or, like I said, taking a shower. But they tend to happen in places where we can be a little bit more introspective. And sometimes they happen in unusual places, like you're driving and all of a sudden as you're driving and you're listening to the song, you're like, why is this song really hitting me? Right.
One of my favorite reasons why I like driving long distances.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I think that's the other reason, again, learning how our system works. The more we learn how our system works, and instead of trying to fight it, trying to be oh, you're marvelous. Because we've been designed in this really interesting way where we have the capacity to deeply connect, but we also have this capacity to dissociate. Now, sometimes dissociating means we can cut off from sides of self, but sometimes it means that we can sort of transport ourselves to other aspects. We can transport ourselves to the past in meaningful ways or difficult ways, or we can imagine ourselves in the future. This is what makes human beings so extraordinary.
Yeah.
But we want to try and see if we can notice how when we turn something that is cutting off into something that transports us in a way that opens up, that's taking what splits us apart into something creative. That's what a creative moment is. If you go to a great concert and all of a sudden you feel transported by the music, you're in a creative moment with the artist. It's not escapist.
No, not at all. Do you, although it can be used for.
It certainly can be used. Anything can be used for escapism completely.
Do you have any, like, if somebody, let's say, goes to a concert and like gets into like that creative state with the artist, should they just like take it and leave it and like, and just stay in that space? Or should, after the concert, should they do something with it?
That's a really good question. Both. Both. You should take it. Any creative experience should be appreciated in its own right, in a way, right? Any beautiful kind of I thou experience, as Martin Buber called them, right? Like when we have this moment where we're communing with something bigger and deeper than ourselves, we should cherish that on its own. And if there's a way in which it opens up something for something bigger, great. It's sort of like, I once had this jazz teacher. He was a pianist, and I once heard him noodling around on the piano and he was playing this beautiful lick. And I was like, oh man, Andy, like that's beautiful. Are you going to write that down? And he said, no, if I forget it, it's okay. Another one will come along. So it's learning also how to be in touch with the creative wonder of the world. And if you're moved to make a painting about it or talk about it or somehow infuse your work, or somehow, let's say, something that you've heard here helps you with something there, great. If not, it's okay. Another creative moment will come along. So I think that's the other thing that you're talking about too, Esty, is like, how do we court and create more creative moments, right? And make room for them as a way of also not only enhancing our sense of connection and fulfillment, but also even our productivity. Because remember that journal I talked about? That journal was also, those little notes are little moments of this creativity, of others' creativity, that becomes sort of
springboard for you.
A springboard. And you never know where that quote from days, months, years ago comes back to you. And you're like, it's like an old teacher. You know how sometimes you hear like an old teacher saying something? Like I had this great English teacher, George Bluin, and he would read like the greats. He'd read Macbeth and Lord of the Flies, and he'd read Brave New World, and he'd read it to us. And every once in a while, those quotes, some moment from it comes back, like tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, right?
Right.
It is a tale, that's Macbeth, or something from that comes back. And so I think being a collector of creative experience is wonderful.
Yeah. And back to like what we said about working with yourself, it's finding the way that works for you. So if those little notebooks are what you need, then you do that. If you need more like quiet time for yourself to create those creative moments, do that, whatever is best for you. Awesome. Okay. Now, before I ask you the final question, where could we connect with you and learn more about you?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So there's a few places. One, I have a Psychology Today blog called Live Life Creatively. And that's a good place to get lots of different things about what I've been talking about. And then my website is just my name, michaelalcee.com. I have a fun TEDx talk that I did on introverts that you can find out there. And then for those who are aspiring to be therapists or are therapists, I'm coming out with a book in May from Norton called Therapeutic Improvisation: How to Stop Winging It and Own It as a Therapist. So I talk a lot about these different ideas of how to make our work artistic and how to help our clients become more creative.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay. Final question. How would you describe an extraordinary relationship without using love, trust, or connection?
Oh, that's cool. That's a great question. I think for me, two words come up: discovery and enigma.
Discovery and what?
Enigma.
Okay.
I think the most intriguing relationships allow you to discover, but they also become sort of these riddles that you keep on trying to figure out. But riddles in a good way. Like riddles and like so there's a writer named Jonah Lehrer, and he came up with a book called Mystery. And he talks about the idea that as human beings, we just love finding new mysteries, and the mystery on top of the mystery, on top of the mystery. And I think that deep relationships allow there to be mystery, but can keep on trying to figure out what this current mystery is. That's where the discovery happens.
Yeah. And that's where the discovery with like the deeper connection.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like almost like, when you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize I learned something new about you, whether you're my significant other or you're my best friend. It's like, that's what I love about therapy. It's like each week, even though I know people quite well, I'm like, oh, that's a cool new facet. That's like a new mystery. Oh, neat. Like, that's cool. Right. Sort of like when you listen to an old song and you're like, oh my gosh, I never heard that. Like, listen to those harmonies in the background. I never realized that. Or the drums, what are they doing?
Yep. The discovery, curiosity together with that. Yep. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Michael. This was fun and really informative. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
That's all for this episode of the Life Fix University podcast, but I have a huge favor to ask of you that will not only support the show, but will also help the people you love most. We are striving for 1 million downloads by the end of 2025, and we can't do this without your help. If you love this episode, please share it with 2 of your family and friends so they too can rewire their brains to have an extraordinary marriage. It was awesome spending time with you, and I'll see you on the next episode.